shouldn't really come as much of a surprise to people that games tend to have three main senses. So you've got sight, you've got sound, and you've got touch. So sight's obviously when you can see, sound's what you can hear, and then touch would be if there's any kind of haptic feedbacks, whether that's vibrations or whatever else that's going on. And just to kind of preface this as a really, really brief history for video game audio, the whole kind of point of this talk was talking about immersion and audio. And I think before really getting into it, you have to think about where video games started from. So before we had video games, the precursor to video games, and even some of the earlier publishers for video games, were companies that made slot machines and pinball machines. Video games, unlike film, always had audio in them from the beginning. So Pong is kind of universally acknowledged as being the first sort of widely available video game, followed sort of a few years later by Space Invaders. Both of these games had audio already in them. So Pong, it's literally about as basic as you can get. It's a beep whenever the ball hits the paddle. In Space Invaders, you had a little sound whenever you shot a missile, and you've also got this 4-note repeating kind of riff that goes down, 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 down. With slot machines and pinball machines then, these had audio in them as well. There is sound design in them, and they are meant to be immersive. So particularly with slot machines, the designers of these didn't just kind of put sounds or music in them at random. It was all kind of meant to create a certain kind of feeling. And this was done through the use of like bells and buzzers. And basically whenever you won, the whole point of the machine was to get loud and get noisy and make it so that everyone around you hears that and goes, oh, this person won, so maybe I'm going to win soon as well. That even comes down to some of like the design choices that were made for the machines. So the fact that whenever the coins were coming out of it, they could have went and made like where the coins fall in to be nicely padded so that they'll lie down and they'll be silent, and you know, they'll collect basically in a nice way, but they don't. They purposely make the collection kind of points for these metal, so the coins whenever they hit them are loud and they're noticeable, so that basically everyone's able to hear them and understands, you know, that there's money coming out of those. This is even like a precursor to sound design that's used in video games. So the whole point of the sound design principles that are used in casino slots, which is probably not something most people have even thought of as having sound design, are meant to immerse the player in the environment. So it's whenever you're there, if anyone's ever been to a casino, it's not just one slot machine you hear or one little kind of musical riff coming out of them. It's a whole bunch of different ones, and they're all basically like competing together with each other for people's attention, and it's kind of the whole mixture of all of them playing together that creates the ambience of a casino itself. If this kind of goes into a little later on, so like jumping forward in time from Pong and Space Invaders from the 70s into the 80s, we kind of all of these arcade cabinets. So if anyone's ever kind of been as well to any of the places that have a bunch of arcade cabinets, you'll know they actually sound quite similar to being in a casino as well. You have a whole lot of different machines and they're all kind of vying for people's attention. So the entire point of the audio development within these was basically to make it so that each of the machines were loud, were noisy, had short recognizable musical riffs, and the whole point was to draw people in, to kind of encourage them, you know, to put in like a coin, to play a game which is likely to last anywhere between sort of 5 and maybe 15 or 20 minutes tops. And then at the end of that, you know, you put in another coin to continue playing, or you move on to a next machine. What we've then got from arcade machines going into sort of the first home consoles, so like the SNES. So anyone who's familiar with like SNES games is likely to have played some of the first Zelda games, so A Link in Time. The way that the audio works in these kind of games compared to how it worked previously in pinball machines and slot machines and then in arcade machines is completely different. So the audio sort of goes from being in a noisy environment where it's short, contained sort of play sessions to being in a home environment, and then being much longer sessions, or replayability became much more important. So with the slot machines and the arcade machines, it's more important to have a loud, recognizable musical score which is catchy, and to have kind of a few kind of big sound effects for actions that you hear or you see on screen. Whenever games move into the home, the way that the audio in them works is completely different. You need something where it's capable of someone listening to this for a prolonged period of time. And then you also basically need it so that whenever you are doing this, that the sounds are more focused on drawing the player in and holding their attention for much longer periods of time. This then kind of brings us from home consoles where it began on the SNES into stuff where it's more modern, so like typically PS4 or PS5 games, where you have things like God of War, you have Horizon, you have Spider-Man, where essentially from a gameplay standpoint it's the same idea of what was used in A Link Before Time. It's just done in a much more immersive and bigger environment with a lot more kind of variables and interactivity that's used in it. And the audio, likewise, in these has built and kind of enhanced itself from these points of views as well, where you have not just sort of simplistic musical scores that play, but actual orchestras, which have all been cut up into sections, musical pieces that weave in between each other, and a whole number of different things and techniques and ways to basically make the audio much more immersive. So this is probably the most, you would say, sort of like academic-y part of this talk that I was going to do. This is called the Eyes of Framework. So this is kind of a bit of framework that was developed for game audio, and it's a way of splitting up and discussing different parts of game audio. So what we kind of have in this is essentially four main sort of areas. So we have diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. So for anyone who's not familiar with these terms, diegetic basically means anything that you can see and then also hear. So this might be, say, if you see an explosion somewhere, well then you would expect to hear that explosion. If you can see kind of like a siren or an alarm, you would expect to be able to hear that alarm. Non-diegetic stuff tends to be things that you can hear but you can't necessarily see. So typically these turn into world building elements. So this might be, again, if you were playing some kind of FPS game, you would expect to hear like shooting but in the distance, or you might hear like vehicles overhead, you know, such as planes or things like that, where sometimes, or even wind and elements like that, where it's things you don't necessarily see, but yeah, they build the immersion and they build kind of the world building inside the game. And then what we also have then on either side of these cubes is settings and activities. So the settings basically in this would relate more to things related to the actual game world itself. So whether these are, you know, ambient kind of props such as torches up on walls or things like that. On them we also have activity on the other side. So activity is typically things which are more player driven. So whether this is interacting with objects, whether it's footsteps, whether it's, you know, vehicle sounds that the player's controlling or stuff like that. So what we also have on top of this then is these different corners in here. So we have zone, effect, affect, and interface. And they're basically just ways of splitting up different elements of sounds. So the zone basically looks towards different kind of spatial sounds that you tend to use inside of the game. So this might be linked more towards like your ambience or your level building stuff. What we have then is effect as well. So effect is typically also relating to ambience, but it's more one-shot things. So rather than it being continuous sounds, it might be things like bird sounds that are playing occasionally, and things like that. What we have as well then is affect in the bottom left corner. So affect typically looks to describe sounds which are meant more to kind of influence the player. So if this was like a horror game or something, it's the sounds which tend to be non-diegetic. So things that you don't necessarily see but you can hear. So whether that's kind of like metal creaking ominously in the background, or if it's creatures that you can hear but not see, things like that. And then interface basically tends to relate to sounds which are more UI or HUD element things. So whether it's clicks or menu items or, you know, inventories and that kind of thing as well. So these are just basic ways of describing some of the elements of game audio that we'll start to look at just basically in the next couple of slides. The next thing as well to basically discuss, which is equally as important to this talk, is this idea of something that's called total immersion. So this is another academic term. It was developed by two academics called Brown and Kearns. And basically there are three kind of sections that relate to total immersion. And this is something that basically everyone who's played games will have encountered at some point or another, even if you've not been explicitly aware of the term itself. So you have engagement, you have engrossment, and then you have the final stage, which itself is total immersion. So how this kind of relates into things then is for engagement, basically, this means that you need to have mastery over the controls of the game. So you need to kind of get it to the point where you're able to play the game without consciously thinking of the controls, so that whenever you want to run and jump on something and you want to perform a specific move, you're not thinking about the buttons you press. Your brain just thinks, this is what I want to happen, and your fingers automatically do it. You also then have like what's called time and attention barriers, which basically means to get a level of engagement, you have to have played the game for a certain amount of time, and you have to actually like it. So you have to be entertained by it. You have to want to play it to get over this first kind of barrier. The second barrier then is what's called engrossment. So within engrossment, this basically relates to the game construction, the feedback loops, so understanding how the game is played, having a deeper understanding of how the mechanics in the game work, so that you know what the techniques of the games are for things that you're able to do and how to apply them basically whenever you're playing the game. And on top of that as well, you need to have some level of an emotional investment in the game. So that basically means like whether it's a narrative standpoint, whether it's competitive, but basically you care about the outcome. So you have to actually be invested in what's actually going on in the game. And then the last kind of section of this is what's called total immersion. So this is basically like a state of mind that once you've mastered the controls of the game, once you've kind of like played it for enough time, once you're engrossed by it, so you understand the feedback loops of the game and you're invested in it, if everything in the game is kind of done to a high standard and you've been playing for a while, total immersion is basically that state of mind you get where people would describe it as being like in the zone, where you don't really think consciously about what you're doing at all. You're just focused on the game and you're thinking about it at like a higher level. And it's basically whenever you reach that point that everything around you, whenever you're playing, it sort of like melts away a bit. So you're not really thinking about the environment you're currently sitting in. You're not thinking about anything else you have to do. The game has your total time and attention and focus. And usually this idea of total immersion, it can be quite fleeting. Whenever you're kind of in the zone, it works really, really well, but it's not typically something that people sustain over really, really long periods of time. Or at least it's very difficult to do. And with the idea of total immersion, then it's basically that point where you don't really notice time passing. And it can be broken at any point, basically by anything. So stuff that can break it could be like if you had a bug in the game, so you're not able to do what should happen. Obvious big ones would be if the game was to crash or something like that. From an audio point of view, what kind of breaks your level of total immersion is whenever you're in this state, you can fully believe that everything that you can hear is reactive and reflective to your actions, and it's realistic. So it's an expected outcome. Your brain isn't thinking, oh, this sound isn't very good, or that should be louder or quieter, or why does this sound a certain way or another. It just accepts and believes what it is that you hear. It can be broken typically by things where it's sounds that play that the brain starts to identify as being repetitive. So if it's an annoying sound that plays too often, that can just break total immersion, because it snaps the brain out of thinking and focusing solely on the task at hand to being like, oh, that's actually a bit distracting. It can also even be broken by stuff that's in the outside world. So like if your phone was to go off and you heard an alert for it, or someone's to shout your name, that can also like break the idea of total immersion. So this is kind of just the stuff that's in the backstory really, as it relates to kind of immersion for audio and what these terms actually mean.